Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst. So welcome back to the program.
Professor, always a pleasure.
So Israel, they recently launched this attack on Doha in Qatar, which I can add, of course, is a close ally of the United States in the Gulf. And well, the purpose behind this attack was, of course, for Israel to try to assassinate the peace negotiators from Hamas who were there again to negotiate. Now, the dust has begun to settle, and we can begin to assess some of the consequence of this. How do you assess the blowback from this attack?
This is akin to, that scene from Godfather 2, the movie, where Michael Corleone is at his house, looks out the window, and all of a sudden gunshots are raining in his bedroom, and he's dragging his wife out of bed to protect her. This was an attack on with the United States, unlike the Emiratis or the Saudis. Al Udeid Air Force Base is the forward headquarters for U.S. Central Command. It is also the headquarters for what's called the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center, CAOC. And that CAOC brings together a number of different countries in it, and it monitors all air traffic in the entire, from Turkey, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, over into Iran. So it covers the entire area. I know from a friend of mine who served there, particularly during 2016, 2017, the commanding general of CAOC was on the phone every day with the Russians, deconflicting, making sure that Russian aircraft and U.S. aircraft didn't run into each other and didn't get into any battles. So this was just not a regular relationship. This was a deep-seated relationship. And for Israel to conduct that kind of attack there is no way, impossible, that it could have happened without U.S. permission and or participation, or both, which is had to be sort of a wake-up call to the Qataris, not just the Qataris, the rest of the region, because everybody's sort of, while the United States treats them like they're a bunch of, second-class, third-class field hands, they themselves have a tendency to look at the United States with some arrogance and, saying, the Americans are not as smart as us. But now, here it was, the Trump administration completely betrayed Qatar. And, I think the betrayal was so profound that it led to this meeting of the Arab Islamic Conference, this emergency summit that brought together 54 heads of state and foreign ministers from the Arab Muslim nations. So you had, the Turks were there, the Azerbaijanis were there, so you got the Turkish culture. You had the Arabs, from Egypt to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Emirates. You had from Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. And our friends, the Houthis, they were there too. Government of Yemen represented. What's odd visuals we saw? There's Iranian President Pezeshkian with newly installed Syrian President al-Shada, formerly known as al-Jilani, the ISIS terrorist, who 2 years ago, his forces were attacking and killing Iranians. So, we're not talking about people who just had disagreements over which football team was best. We're talking about people that were directing military operations against one another. Similarly, Turkey there with the Iranians. Iran was featured prominently, sitting in the conference with President or Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and then with President al-Sisi of Egypt, in which they made the announcement, hey, we're going to reopen diplomatic relations. I think that's, first time in 45 years. So, almost half a century since the Iranian Revolution, Egypt and Iran had parted ways, and now they're coming together. Maybe that qualifies Donald Trump alone for the Nobel Peace Prize, bringing Iran and Egypt back together. Sort of the other sign of the alarm that was signaled by this is that Jordan, after 34 years, is now announcing a new conscription campaign, recruiting new soldiers, drafting new soldiers to build up its forces. So overall, I view this as a big rebuff to U.S. diplomacy.
Well, there's seems like a wider theme. That is, in East Asia, you have South Korea and Japan starting to reconsider some of their excessive security dependence on the U.S. In Europe as well, is a similar sentiment. That is, we outsourced a lot of our foreign policy and security to the U.S., and then suddenly Trump started laying claims on Greenland after Denmark gave away all its weapons to the proxy war in Ukraine. So it is interesting that, shifts will happen within the Middle East as well. But all of this is happening now at the backdrop of this UN Commission report, which finds that Israel has indeed committed genocide. I don't think this was a big revelation to most people, but given that these reports come from the United Nations, it does put some pressure on, all the countries in the world to do something. I mean, it does seem that the EU shifted its tune from this enthusiastic support and complicity in genocide to now seeming a bit more cautious, wanting to wash their hands with the whole thing. Now, whether or not this will be significant or political theater, I'm not quite sure. How do you see the consequences from the UN report?
Well, it's a movement in the right direction, and I think you're very astute to note that it's more political theater than actual substance. Let's start first with the Arab Islamic Summit and their declaration that they issued. In it, they talk about taking action, joint action to get Israel removed, expelled from the United Nations, which, in light of this report, means that there may be actually some momentum behind that movement to make that happen. And this comes on the heels of last week when the United States joined the other members, both permanent and temporary members of the UN Security Council, to censure Israel for its attack on Qatar. The diplomatic solution was not to mention Israel by name, but it was along the lines of, that guy in the black suit that's standing there on the corner with the umbrella in his hand and wearing the boulder hat. Yeah, that's who we're sanctioning. You go, oh, you mean Ed? No, don't say the name. But as long as you don't say the name, it's like Voldemort. Don't say the name, but we know who it is. So that was the first time. I can't remember the last time Israel got sanctioned in the UN Security Council. So there does seem to be developing some political will finally among the Arab Islamic Council and the BRICS nations. I maintain that BRICS and the Arab Islamic Council acting together could stop the war in Gaza, stop the genocide, by declaring a complete, total economic embargo on Israel, shut down all commerce with it. What's curious is Israel itself now is talking about having to, quote, go it on its own, that it's going to have to be surviving alone. It can't do it. They're delusional. But the fact that they're beginning to recognize how isolated they are. But we're still at the point where the one government in the world that could make a difference immediately is Turkey, by actually cutting off the flow of oil to Israel. And so far, Turkey has declined to do that, even though Erdogan attended that summit, as did the government of Yemen. So, they're starting to move in the right direction. And now with this UN report, which takes it outside of the Arab Islamic Summit and brings it into a broader context within the global South, including countries in Africa and Central and South America, there may be movement.
Well, I'm thinking the countries in the region, though, they must see the wider implications, because this isn't simply mass slaughter in Gaza. This is also spilled into the toppling of the government in Syria, the partial destruction of Libya, the frequent attacks on Yemen. You're having Israeli leaders start to talk about Greater Israel, where they just casually throw out a map where they take a chunk of neighboring countries. Of course, the attack on Iran. I mean, a lot of this must be making some of the regional actors a bit unsettled and concerned. Especially, it doesn't seem as if Israel is doing this out of strength.
Right.
On the contrary, because the United States, it's indicating it wants to pivot a bit away from the region, and this presence also in the wider shifts of power as the power shifts towards the east. You would think that Israel would calculate that, given it has a stronger hand today than it will tomorrow, it would want to get a peace deal today. But instead, they seem to be going in for all-out victory over everyone, while their main ally, the United States, still has, I guess, a dominant presence in the region. But it's starting to look a bit like a suicidal state, because it's very hard to see how this can have a happy ending for Israel, though.
Yeah, no, I agree. Israel starts, like every country, with finite resources, both in terms of manpower, government finance, and natural resources. In fact, Israel is at somewhat of a big disadvantage, because it is a relatively small country with, now 7 million people, maybe less, as well as dependence on outside oil supply and natural gas. It is not rich in any natural resource, and yet it is expanding the war by attacking. It's attacking Yemen, attacking Syria, attacking Lebanon, attacked Qatar, trying to conduct ground operations in Libya, Syria, West Bank, as well as Gaza. And we're coming up on 2 years since this, really the start of the response from October 7th attacks by Hamas. And just step back and look at it in terms of, we hear a lot of criticism from in terms of Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine from people like General Kellogg, the other day, Ukraine's winning, Russia's losing, because Russia's only taking a little bit of territory. Okay, let's apply that to Gaza. In Gaza, you've got an area of about 25, 28 square miles. It's not a huge area, or it's, 20 miles long, 5 miles wide. That'd be more like 100 square miles. But still, it's a contained area. It's not uncontained. It is basically, the Israelis have it surrounded. The Hamas fighters are in a position where they can't just routinely receive shipments of weapons being flown in or sent in via maritime routes. The Israelis have tanks, armored vehicles, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, artillery, mortars, overhead imagery, vast intelligence resources. And they have a very easy way to get resupplied with both food, ammunition, medicine, first aid supplies. Hamas has none of that. They have rifles and some sidearms and some mortars, but they're not carrying around heavy weaponry. And yet, despite the full weight of the Israeli army, which outnumbers Hamas, at least on 3-1, and it continues to inflict casualties on Israel. I mean, it's a remarkable story. Will go down in history as one of the most heroic, perhaps tragic, efforts against tyranny in human history. But so far, they've held the Israelis off, And it's now a question of how long can the Israelis sustain this? Because the strains it's placing upon the society has led to an increase in the number of suicides among reservists. And the fracturing in Israel politically is very sharp and divided. So, it's a question of how long they can sustain this, and hopefully they don't compound the problem by attacking Iran, because I think if they decide to attack Iran again, the United States will not be able to save Israel by a last-minute intervention and cutting a deal with Tehran.
Yeah, there is something deeply rational here. I had a talk with an Israeli journalist who was Gideon Levy, who was making the point that as the more the world kind of turns on Israel, the more it kind of fuels this besieged mentality that, the world is against us, and it's unjust, and this is why, they have to stay strong. So it kind of it fuels this very irrational policy. But on that topic, though, I'm glad you mentioned Kellogg, because I did want to ask about what's happening on the Ukrainian front, and as you suggest, that this is quite remarkable. After 3.5 years, I mean, of the war going on, we have General Keith Kellogg, who is now coming out saying that the Russians are losing the war. I mean, this is just incredible. I know that the key objective in the information war, and it is a very powerful information war, is to keep the war going. So gain public support for the war. So you always have to say the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are taking huge losses. But still, the whole speech he gave about, again, inflating the Russian casualties, downplaying the Ukrainian ones. He made the comment that Russia was pulling tanks out of museums. This is just very strange. The largest newspapers in the United States, I think both New York Times and Washington Post, has reported that the Russian military is just pumping out tanks, but they're all being sent to the rear for a buildup. And suddenly he just comes here and says, no, they're pulling tanks out of the museums from World War II because they have nothing left. I mean, this is... how are you interpreting this? Is this him? I mean, it all comes down to either stupidity or belligerence. I mean, how do you explain? He surely can't believe in the things he's saying.
Well, I share your skepticism, and that surely he can't be this stupid. That he's just deliberately lying to play a propaganda role. But I actually think he may genuinely, truly believe this, but he's not using any critical thinking skills. If you listen to his argument on the surface, is that, boy, Ukraine is inflicting massive casualties on the Russians, and the Russians are barely taking any territory. They're just creeping forward by inches, if anything. Okay, but then we've had the last two exchanges of military dead, where Ukraine turns over the dead Russians and Russia turns over the dead Ukrainians. The last two times have been at a 50-to-1 ratio. For every one Russian soldier that is turned over, there are 50 dead Ukrainians. Well, how can that be if Kellogg is correct? And I'd love to ask him that question to hear his answer. Because he said, no, that's Russia. That's, he could turn it around. But the fact of the matter is 50 dead Ukrainians for every dead Russian. Well, so I've heard some argue, oh, no, well, that's simply because the Russians are moving so fast over the battleground that the Ukrainians don't have time to go out and collect the dead bodies of the Russians. So wait a second. Kellogg was saying they're advancing so slowly, they're not moving at all. And now all of a sudden you're telling me they're moving so fast that the Ukrainians don't have time to recover the body. Which is it? Fast or slow? Just, let's pick a storyline and stick with it for consistency's sake. It really doesn't matter what he says or what he believes, because it's not going to alter the reality on the ground. All it's going to do is produce greater alarm in the West when the full collapse starts. And that collapse may not be far off. Already in the last 2 weeks, again, Kellogg apparently doesn't believe General Sirski, who said that Russia enjoys a 3-to-1 advantage of manpower along the front. How did that happen? Because you go back 3.5 years, it was Ukraine that enjoyed like a 2 to 3-to-1 advantage in troop size, not Russia. So that's been completely reversed. And part of the reason it's been completely reversed is because of the catastrophic losses Ukraine has suffered.
Yeah, this was the argument that the Ukrainians had lost, 30,000 troops, yet they have to now mobilize hundreds of thousands. It's this very strange empathy, fake empathy for Ukraine, where they downplay all the horrors which are happening, from their casualties on the front line to the brutal recruitment of Ukrainians. I mean, even the polls showing that the Ukrainians want immediate negotiations to end this. None of this will appear in the media. None of this will be mentioned by the people like Kellogg, because it all undermines public support for the war effort. So
Right.
again, this is what happens when you fight with men from which are not your own. I was curious to how you assess the whole drone situation now, because I'm again, the information war, I'm aware, is raging on all sides, so one has to be a bit cautious about the information. But from Poland now, you're seeing this huge online what is it called, social media activity
Yeah.
almost, where people are mocking their own government because there were some decoy drones. They kind of suspect that it was the Ukrainians who sent them, and I see in the pictures this is drones with duct tape on them, and I mean, it doesn't seem like everyone is completely convinced. And again, I'm not a weapons expert, but I would have thought, if you really wanted to convince everyone, avoid any speculation or conspiracy theories, then why not have a proper investigation of this? But
Right.
instead, someone points the finger at Russia, and in this climate, who is able to say, well, are we sure about this? Shall we take a good look? I mean, that makes you pro-Russian. You're a defender of Putin. You're not allowed to criticize any accusations at all. So you just end up with the crazies controlling the dialogue. But how are you assessing this drone situation?
Well, my favorite meme so far that I've seen is this kid. All of a sudden, he hears this rum, 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 and he says, "Oh my God, a drone!" And he ducks down. And then next thing you see is somebody's dragging their suitcase along cobblestones. So it was the suitcase, not the drone. Um, it is now clear that this was a Ukrainian operation designed to try to create a provocation to compel Poland and then NATO to join in the war. It's a sign of the desperation of Ukraine.
How do we know that, though, or what information have we access to so far?
Yeah, because when you look at where the some of the drones, as you correctly noted, duct tape, were drones that had gone down inside Ukraine. And then, I'm making an analytical leap there, but I'm very confident in that there was no other reason or purpose for this. I mean, look, if Russia's going to hit them with drones, by God, they're going to send drones with some explosives that can do some damage, and they're going to hit military targets. That's not what this was. And in fact, we're not even sure how many drones there were. If we take Radoslav Sikorski's number, it was 19. And of that 19, with all the vaunted air defense and combat aircraft that have been deployed forward, they only managed to shoot down 3 of these drones. And when you looked at the drones, it was clear that it looks like they had been recovered from the battlefield or from attacks in Ukraine and repurposed. They were duct taped together. These were not sophisticated drones. then you get into the whole question of why is these, Poland and these NATO partners using weapon systems that cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to take down drones that cost, $5,000 maybe or less. I mean, these were not expensive models at all. So the economics doesn't work there. But the attempt failed. You remember Russia right at the outset said, we don't know anything about it, but hey, we're happy to sit down and talk to you about it. Bring us what you got. We'll look at it. If we did something, we're sorry. But to our knowledge, we didn't do anything because that distance from the Russian front lines in the Donbass is exceeds the range capability of Russian drones of the type that were being used. So, Russia played it sort of very cool and matter of fact, whereas the West was screaming hysterically, like a teenage girl whose cell phone has been stolen, just trying to get attention. And it's gone nowhere. So I think I take this as just another symptom or piece of evidence of Ukraine's collapse.
You say the West reacted hysterically, but I guess more accurately would say that the Europeans acted hysterically
Yeah.
because the Europeans got a bit upset with Trump because he did not join in on the hate fest and the panic because he seemed very dismissive of the whole thing. And I would say, in all fairness, the only thing that seems to have been struck was one house in Poland, and then they found out later on there was a Polish missile anyways.
Yeah.
So Trump seemed to dismiss the whole thing. I'm not sure if he didn't buy into the story or if he just doesn't want to escalate with the Russians. But but the desire by the Europeans to get a powerful response from the United States kind of is an indicator of where they're standing in this whole thing. Not, putting aside who was behind the drones. This eagerness to constantly get the Americans pull the Americans back into the war. It seems to indicate that the Europeans don't really have any strategy beyond prolonging the war, keeping the Ukrainians in the fight, and having more American support for the war. I don't hear any clear strategies in terms of objectives and how to achieve those.
Yeah, you're right. It is throw the jello at the wall, hope something sticks, and maybe that'll be our plan. Europe has lost the ability to produce in industrial quantities weapon systems that would allow them to keep Ukraine in the fight against Russia, in terms of, with losses, being able to provide replacements, whether we're talking for artillery shells or Patriot missile batteries or Storm Shadow missiles. Pick your favorite weapon system. None of the countries, neither Germany, France, UK, or the United States, have the industrial depth to be able to produce it in great volumes and to ramp production up well beyond what it is now. And yet we continue to be confronted with this, the same story. Just we get different verses to it. Verse 1 in 2022 was, "Oh, the Russians are running out of missiles any day now, any day. They can't keep this up." And then that was followed by, "Oh, they're having to cannibalize washing machines and refrigerators for computer chips because they don't have enough chips to put in their missiles." So that was the 2022 into 2023. Well, then the reality hit in 23, 24 that Ukraine simply did not have enough artillery shells, and the West was incapable of producing what they would use up in 1 month. So that they were falling behind with that. Patriot missile batteries were being destroyed, and then they discovered that, you're going to need, you'll fire 2 Patriot missiles, maybe 4, to take down an incoming Russian rocket or missile. Except Lockheed Martin only produces 550 to 600 of those a year. Missiles. We're not talking the launchers. We're talking the actual missiles. So right off the bat, you got they can produce 550 missiles, and yet Russia can launch in one day 810 drones and missiles. So Russia has the complete, military and industrial capability to completely overwhelm the West to a point that the West cannot compete.
Well, I I also see Trump's rhetoric towards Russia is well, it can be interpreted, I guess, in many ways. As you've probably seen, he's calling for the Europeans to do full secondary sanctions on all Russian oil. They have to cut themselves completely off, but also buying off India or anyone else, and again also put sanctions on India and anyone else for trading with Russia. Now, he in this tweet or Truth Social message, he was writing that he's ready to go all in on sanctions and really crush Russia. But first, all NATO countries, all of them, that would include countries like Turkey, have to agree to stop buying all oil. And this, I'm not sure how well you can, I guess, interpret it in two ways. One is he's putting up a bluff for the Europeans to essentially blame them for not wanting to go through with this, so he has the anti-Russian credentials without having to actually do anything. Alternatively, he's trying to pressure the Europeans into something larger. It could be both. I tend to lean a bit towards the former, but I was curious how you see this whole debacle.
Well, I don't know if this was Trump's strategy from the outset. I think our friend Alex Craner might, he says, "See, I was right." I love Alex and his willingness to try to assume that Trump may be smarter than we think. Uh, I'm in a slightly different camp. I don't think Trump necessarily planned it this way, but he is certainly taking advantage of how it is turning out. And what I mean by that is he has now put the onus completely on Europe that, hey, we, the United States, boy, we're all in. We will fight with you, with supply Ukraine to the end, but you guys go first. You guys put up the money. You guys provide the missiles. You impose the sanctions. You take the hit there, and then we'll jump on board with you. Yeah. And Europe's going, no, wait a second. No. You go first. And Trump said, no, we're not doing that. This is your war. We'll be happy to help you as friends. We're there, but you've got to do it. And whatever consensus may have existed prior to that just completely, flew apart, fragmented. And so nobody's, here's the UK, for example. They just signed a free trade agreement with India, giving their colonial history with India. And, Starmer's like, I'm not going backwards. We're not going to go tell the Indians, so, go pound sand. We've changed our mind. We're going to do what the United States wants. So this is, Glenn, I think, just one more example of how what was the U.S. hegemony on both the economic, political, and military front. This is one more example of that hegemony fading, disappearing. We've seen it militarily with the Houthis driving the U.S. Navy out of the Red Sea. Trump can claim they capitulated all he wants, but that's, just simply not the case. Economically, you got India and China selling off their T-bills, their U.S. Treasury bills, and beginning to conduct trading transactions with major companies, both within BRICS and without, based upon their respective currencies. So the demand for the dollar has gone away, and we've got some evidence that this is in fact the case. According to data recorded through June in 2025, the number of SWIFT transactions have declined 15% compared to 2024. Well, that's a significant number. And SWIFT transactions, if people don't understand what I'm talking about, it's simply the way international banks move money from one point to the other. It's an email system. It's a little slow and clunky, but it has been the major way to identify what kind of movement, whether Russia was sending China money because it would usually go through a dollar, they'd have to buy dollars or sell dollars to send dollars. That's all changing. So you've got the United States in a weaker position economically, weaker position militarily, weakened position politically, becoming more isolated by virtue of its support for Israel, and with Russia and China, by contrast, acquiring greater respect and more support around the world. So it's a dangerous, volatile time when you've got someone who's used to being in charge finding out that they're no longer in charge.
Yeah, China rolled out their alternative to SWIFT. I think it was back in 2015. To a large extent, I think, as a response to what was happening in Crimea, because this is when the West cut off Crimea
Right.
from SWIFT, and it was a bit of ironic thing, because they said Crimea is under occupation, so they didn't cut off the rest of Russia; they just cut off the part they said were occupied. So it was a strange approach. But Russia also has now their own alternative, and this has ramifications as well for the United States. It's not just they're not using the banks or dollars, but if you're not using the SWIFT anymore, this was used to gather in a lot of information, so they know what kind of trade deals are being made between China, Brazil. Because if they're not using this anymore, then they're missing out on this information and the ability to effectively prepare American farmers for, well, realistic what they can expect in terms of demand. They can't really do this without having clear overview over the numbers. So
Right.
it's having a lot of ramifications down the line. I don't think they've thought this one completely through, because not just Russia, the whole world is now thinking, we could be next. So
Yeah,
but
yeah. Look, you're exactly right that they didn't think it through. One thing they didn't take into account is that when you're trading in dollars, so let's say you're China and you wanted to buy uh, soybeans. Well, let's say now they're buying soybeans from Brazil. So let's say under the old system, they were still buying their soybeans from Brazil, but China would go out to the open market, buy dollars, and then send those dollars to Brazil, and then Brazil could keep the dollars or convert it to some other currency or send it offshore. That was then. What's happening now is, and it did happen in the last 3 months, that uh, China canceled its contracts to buy soybeans from the United States because of the tariffs, as a sign of its displeasure, shifted all of that business to Brazil. And all of a sudden, that exchange is made in the Chinese currency and the Brazilian currency. Then they're not buying dollars. Okay. So what does that mean? You got this pool of dollars sitting out there, and the demand for it's going down. Well, if you've got a quantity X of something and the demand for it is shrinking, then the price of it goes down as well, because there's not as many people competing for it, as opposed to say, hey, we have 2 tickets to my favorite rock band, and there's maybe 100 of you wanting to get it. I'll take it from the highest bidder. So the limited quantity, big demand will drive the price up. Well, right now the United States is facing this, let's call it a flood of excess dollars sitting out there in the international market. On top of that, you've got India and China selling off their U.S. Treasury bills. So what that does is it increases the supply of dollars to the point that the price of the dollar goes down. The dollar is less valuable because there's so much of it. And it's good news if you're producing something in the United States that you want to sell overseas, because that means it's what you're selling overseas is cheaper. But let's say I want to be a wine distributor for great wines of Australia and New Zealand. Dollars for a box of wine last year. This year is now $20. I have to pay $20 to get it, just because the dollar is now worth less. Well, that means if I'm going to sell that wine in the United States, the price is going to go up, and this is what helps trigger inflation, which is in fact what the United States is experiencing right now.
I did want to ask one last question based on, again, there's a lot of developments on the map now, as you see in Ukraine, as there's, that is the entire Zaporizhia front in the south appears to be falling apart
Correct.
quickly, but you also see Siversk in a pincer, you have Kupiansk in a pincer, you have Pokrovsk in a pincer, you have something the developing around Konstantinovka as well. I'm not sure if it's a proper pincer yet, but you can see kind of the developments taking place, and which is with each of these ones, the Ukrainians are taking even higher losses in the attempt to rescue the situation, which they can't. And of course, when the whole thing falls apart, they see that the casualties spike. But as all of this is happening, I also see them starting to soften up the targets on the western side of the Dnieper, then primarily in Kherson, and but also targeting very heavily Odessa as well.
Yeah.
It does appear that they're making preparations to at least make some partial crossing in Kherson to take some of the islands. But how are you assessing the situation? Do you think the Russians will go all the way now for Odessa? Because if they can't get a deal, and the NATO is determined, or the Europeans said they will send troops to Ukraine after the war, surely Russians can't accept having NATO troops in Odessa. Do you think they will go all the way, or do we know anything beyond speculation?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, we got the the map that General Gerasimov had hung in when he did a briefing a couple of weeks ago, and it showed Odessa and Transnistria as part of Russia on the map, which really caused a lot of consternation in the part of the West.
I didn't
So,
catch Transnistria, though. I'm not saying it wasn't there. I didn't pick up on it. I mean,
yeah, yeah, Transnistria was also listed. So,
oh,
they're going, "Oh." Now, Vladimir Putin and both, and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, have said in the last, 3 to 4 months, I'd have to go back and pull the specific quote, but basically that was saying, if, "Here's the deal that we've offered. If you don't accept that, then the next deal is we're gonna be taking additional territory up to, and someone mentioned 6 more territories." Well, you sit there and go, Kharkiv, uh, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Transnistria, so it'll total up. I firmly believe that before this is over, Russia will have possession of all territory east of the Dnieper River and will also have captured and taken control of Kiev, because Kiev is so important within Russian history as really the beginning, the birth of Russia. And so I don't see them letting that go. They've basically taken the attitude, we've given Ukraine every chance in the world to surrender, to make a deal. I remember my conversation along with Judge Napolitano and Mario Naval when we spoke with Sergei Lavrov in March. And Foreign Minister Lavrov is very clear in saying, look, with that agreement we signed off on that would have allowed the Donbass, both Donetsk and Luhansk, to stay as part of Ukraine, that was brought to the table by the Ukrainians, and we agreed to it just because it had the provisions to protect the people in those oblasts. But he said Ukraine walked away from it, so we changed the deal. We've now made them part of Russia, and then he said, and that's not going to change. They're not going back. The same for Zaporizhia and Kherson. So I anticipate that as the war continues, Russia is going to take back. They will take back Odessa. It is too important a part of Russian history.
for the life of me, I can't understand why there's not more willingness on the western side to strike a compromise, as well as Zelensky. I mean, if they lose Odessa, as well, become a landlocked country, and what it means in terms of the humanitarian problems of people leaving their homes and being dislocated, it's displaced. It's just it's going to be impossible for Ukraine to recover as a country. If they also lose Odessa, the whole country could fragment. It's
Yeah.
just, it's incredible that they can't. I mean, there's no pathway to peace, that's pathway to victory here. So why, I just don't understand even the reluctance to talk to the Russians on the European side. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's very extremely frustrating to watch, but and all of while they're doing this under the banner of no, we're standing with Ukraine, you know, like to the last Ukrainian. It's very, very dark, but
Well, you know, Glenn, this is why you could never be a political leader in Europe. You're too rational, you're too logical, and you're too sensible. Okay? So when you got rationality, logic, and sensibility, because we're seeing the exact opposite here. You know, because what you've outlined is exactly what should be happening. And if there was actually even a, you know, a smidgen of human compassion for the Ukrainians, for people, for God's sake. But, you know, throughout this process, we have seen the West continually provoke Russia and push Russia because they have no desire whatsoever to live in peace with Russia.
yeah, a colleague of mine wrote an article. He made the point, you know, if we send more weapons, if the only thing we can achieve is that Ukraine loses slower and lose therefore more men, is it worth doing? And he was attacked for this. It's anti-Ukrainian. So it's yeah, welcome to post rational Europe. But
Yeah,
it's,
you know, I don't know about, well, okay, you're the historian. You tell me, as you've gone back and you've read history of World War I, the histories of World War II. Did you ever have those moments where you were reading that, trying to say, how could people have thought this way, or couldn't they have seen this, what was unfolding?
yeah, people also ask this about especially World War One. How could you not see what direction this was going? But and you know, you kind of look at history as or people a bit dumber back then, but look where we are now. We can't win the war, but we don't want to talk to the opponent. Our only solution is let's do long range strikes into Russia. At the moment when the Russians are finishing off Ukraine, they're angry as hell about Europe, and they don't really think that the Americans will come to the rescue of Europe if they would strike back. So of all times, this is when we're gonna do direct strikes on Russia, attack the world's largest nuclear power. We know that they consider this to be an existential threat, and even if this will be successful, they're not going to go silent into the night. They would use anything at their disposal, including nuclear weapons. So, well, what is the strategy? But I never heard anyone, no politician in Europe, talk about strategy. What do you want to achieve? How can it be achieved? Nothing. It's just these slogans. It's extremely irresponsible. But I've already taken a bit too much of your time.
No,
Larry,
no, no.
so,
It's always a pleasure to talk with you and get your perspective as well. And so I thank you for the invitation.
thank you again for coming on.
All right, my
Bye.
friend. Bye bye.